the man placed a mysterious device in the desert, and after it spun a few times, the device began to move on its own. 1, 2, 3 sounds echoed through the desert, at which point, a disturbance suddenly occurred a kilometer away. Dust rose in the desert, and something seemed to be quickly burrowing through the sand towards them. The people here were frightened and quickly stood up. The desert lord was about to stir up a sand wave hundreds of meters high. People on the plain watched helplessly as a 1,000-ton armored vehicle was swallowed by the desert lord. The giant mouth, filled with countless fangs, blinked, and in an instant, it devoured the armored vehicle. The desert lord was actually a gigantic sandworm, and the young boy holding a small sickle was about to tame the sandworm and make it his mount. He started running quickly in the direction of the sandworm, when suddenly, the center of the desert began to collapse. Was the boy about to fall in? He leaped into the air and jumped down. After sliding down for a while, he managed to grab hold of the sandworm's skin with the sickle. The sandworm opened its pores, attempting to suck the boy in, but the boy struggled to hold on. Could he successfully tame the sandworm? It turned out that this was the world of humanity 10,000 years later, after a great war with AI had left humanity severely weakened. At that time, gold was worthless, and spices had replaced it. Spices could enhance human abilities and be converted into energy. Without spices, interstellar travel would be impossible. In fact, spices were the excrement of the sandworms. Humans used spices as energy and left Earth, expanding to other star systems, where they were all controlled by the imperial family. The emperor had two powerful factions under his command, the highly respected House Atreides and the wealthy House Harkonnen. The two families were not on good terms. In the galaxy, the planet Arrakis was the only one producing spices, but its harsh environment nurtured fierce natives. These natives mined the spice, and currently, House Harkonnen managed the operation. They monopolized spice production for the entire galaxy, and for the past 80 years, House Harkonnen had been wealthier than the Emperor. The Emperor intended to suppress House Harkonnen, so one day, a spaceship arrived outside House Atreides. The messenger brought a command. House Atreides would replace House Harkonnen to govern the planet Arrakis, which meant overseeing spice production. The head of House Atreides knew this was the Emperor's plot to incite a war between the two families, weakening both sides, but the Emperor's order could not be refused. Paul was the only son of the family and the next heir. He had been undergoing strict training under his teachers since childhood. His mother had the power of voice control, a supernatural ability to control people with sound, but Paul had not mastered it. One night, Paul was awakened by his mother, who took him to the Reverend Mother of the Sisterhood. This was Paul's trial before heading to Arrakis. The Reverend Mother asked him to place his hand in a small box. Suddenly, she pulled out a poison needle and pointed it at Paul's carotid artery, warning him that if he removed his hand during the trial, he would die. As the trial began, a sharp pain shot through Paul's body, and tears welled up in his eyes. The pain intensified, reaching deep into his bones. The hallucinations before him deepened his fear, but his expression gradually became resolute. The Reverend Mother watched him closely and finally withdrew the poison needle, announcing that Paul had passed the test. Paul was the Chosen One. It was said that the Chosen One was so powerful that they could connect time and space, past and future, and was the hope of the entire universe. Meanwhile, Paul's teacher, as part of the advanced team, completed the occupation task excellently. Thus, the head of House Atreides and Paul arrived on Arrakis, and when the spaceship doors opened, a fierce wind carrying yellow sand made it impossible to open their eyes. The natives watched them from a distance, their eyes full of vigilance and concern. Upon reaching the camp, before they could rest, Paul noticed that a tiny poison needle, about the size of a mosquito, seemed to be controlled by someone. As Paul observed the door, it suddenly opened. He quickly grabbed the poison needle to prevent the maid from being harmed. The assassin was soon captured. As expected, he was a spy sent by House Harkonnen. The battle between the two families had begun, and the problems were far from over. During an inspection, they discovered that the spice mining equipment left by House Harkonnen was all defective, greatly reducing the speed of spice extraction. The next day, the doctor, a judge appointed by the Emperor, brought them distillation suits. These suits could recycle water in the body and filter it into drinkable water. He then led the head of the family and others to the spice extraction site. In the distant yellow sand, it seemed that creatures were moving and getting closer. The sandworm alert went off. On this sandy planet, there existed giant sand beasts. They lurked beneath the sand, highly sensitive to sounds, and when angered, They would devour everything. The natives called them the Desert Lords, because the current hard currency was spice, which was actually the excrement of sandworms. The natives had calculated the timing of the sandworm's defecation, and would extract the spice just before the sandworm arrived, using carriers to evacuate the spice mining vehicles. But today, a fixed point on the carrier broke, and they could not leave in time. The sandworm was only 3 minutes away. The team leader intended to rescue them, but as Paul stepped into the desert rich with spice, a wave of dizziness hit him. He touched the spice with its strange fragrance, feeling a sense of familiarity. It was as if Paul had been hypnotized, kneeling in front of the mining vehicle, unable to get up, completely forgetting the imminent danger. In a critical moment, his subordinate woke him up and took him back to the plane. Just as they took off, the mining vehicle was swallowed by the massive sandworm. The sandworm's mouth was enormous. This was Paul's first time witnessing the true form of the sandworm. After returning to the base, he still felt a lingering fear. His mother, worried about Paul's dazed state, found a doctor for him. The doctor believed it was an allergic reaction to the spice, but Paul didn't think it was that simple. Once again, he saw the native girl from his dreams in a hallucination. They kissed, and she killed him with a dagger. In the hallucination, his mother was pregnant. When his mother heard this, her expression froze, because she had just discovered that there was indeed a life growing inside her. She couldn't understand how Paul's hallucinations were leading him to such a destiny. As night fell, a soldier guarding outside the base suddenly fell to the ground, struck by an arrow. The patriarch, hearing a noise, stealthily went outside to investigate. A poison needle struck his back. The one who tried to assassinate him was none other than the doctor they had trusted for many years. The patriarch's shield was broken, which also meant the defense line was breached. The sirens wailed, and missiles from House Harkonnen exploded, destroying the base. Meanwhile, the Emperor's forces joined the battle and captured Paul and his mother. However, they dared not touch the Bene Gesserit, so they planned to throw mother and son into the desert, hoping the sandworms would deal with them. The mother signaled to Paul. The person with the scar was deaf. Paul immediately understood his mother's intention. She used her voice manipulation power to command the assailant to tear the cloth from her mouth. The mother's mental powers grew stronger. "Kill him! Let us go!" The mother's shackles were removed, but the captain noticed something was wrong. He covered her mouth, but the mother bit his finger with all her strength. The captain, in pain, let go, and the mother finally managed to escape. The doctor brought the patriarch to Baron Harkonnen. The Baron delivered an impassioned victory speech. The patriarch, catching him off guard, left one final remark: "I have come here, and I shall remain forever." The patriarch bit down hard, opened his mouth, and released poisonous gas. Everyone present was infected by the gas. It turned out that the patriarch had a false tooth filled with poison. Both families were severely weakened, and the burden of the future was now on Paul. At this moment, Paul once again had a vision. He saw himself as one of the natives, fighting with his father's expectations and his family's honor. Paul was terrified. He feared his hands would be stained with blood and that he couldn't bear this heavy responsibility. After a long time of contemplation, he finally chose to take his father's accessories and accept the mission laid before him. The next morning, mother and son met with Paul's teacher. They had learned of everything that had happened. Paul realized that this was all the Emperor's conspiracy. Both House Atreides and House Harkonnen were victims of the Emperor. Now, only unity could allow them to fight back. The Emperor's army had already come after them again. Paul's teacher fought alone and fell in a pool of blood. Mother and son, with the help of the doctor, boarded the plane and sought the help of the natives. Along the way, House Harkonnen's enemy planes relentlessly pursued them. To avoid the attacks, Paul dove into a sandstorm. The aircraft shook violently, and in front of him, all he could see was the rolling yellow sand. Suddenly, a vision of the future appeared before him. An old man whispered, "Go with the flow, follow the rise and fall." After hearing this, Paul tossed the controls aside and let the aircraft fly through the sandstorm. He finally shook off the enemy planes and landed safely. Mother and son embarked on the difficult journey to find the natives. After a day and night of walking, they entered a patch of desert and found that the sand here was unusually hard. They stepped on it a few times, and the sound attracted a sandworm. They quickly fled toward a distant rock. The sandworm finally revealed its true form. Its massive, tooth-filled mouth resembling a black hole, capable of devouring the whole world. Mother and son couldn't see its eyes but could feel that it was staring at Paul. Though it didn't move further, they dared not make any sudden movements. The surroundings were eerily silent. After a tense pause, a distant knocking sound echoed. The sandworm was immediately drawn to it, burrowing into the sand and heading toward the abyss. Before mother and son could catch their breath, several natives appeared and surrounded them, their eyes full of vigilance. Paul recognized their leader, the one his teacher had introduced to them earlier. Someone else in the group caught Paul's attention. It was the girl who had appeared many times in his dreams. Paul dared not approach her and only observed quietly. At this moment, their fates intertwined. The leader intended to take mother and son to the underground city. Someone stepped forward and challenged Paul to a duel. The girl handed Paul a dagger, the very same dagger that had appeared in his visions. Everyone except Paul's mother doubted his chances in this duel. They exchanged several moves. Paul pressed the blade to the warrior's neck, trying to force him to surrender, but according to native tradition, there was no surrender, only death. As the warrior lunged at him, Paul swiftly sidestepped and drove the dagger into his back. This victory earned Paul their respect. On the way back to the underground city, Paul saw the natives riding sandworms. He marveled at their power and the power of the desert. Paul placed an object on the ground, and after a few rotations, it began to move by itself. The sound of 1, 2, 3 clicks echoed across the desert. Suddenly, about a kilometer away, there was movement. The sand rose in a cloud, and the sandworm rapidly burrowed through the sand toward them. The people around them grew tense. Paul calmly paced and carefully observed the direction of the swirling sands. He gripped the sandhook tightly, waiting for the right moment to face his final test. The sandstorm grew closer, and the sandworm's true form finally emerged. Its massive, abyss-like mouth coming toward Paul. The sandworm, the most terrifying and precious creature on this desert planet, could destroy a sand dune in an instant and rule the desert. Paul raised the sandhook high and leaped toward the sandworm. He hooked into the worm's skin. With the yellow sand buffeting him, Paul stood up, holding the sandhook in both hands. It was amazing. Paul had succeeded. The sandworm had become his mount. He stood firmly on the sandworm's back, riding it freely through the desert. He had tamed the sandworm. Everyone raised their arms and cheered for him, declaring Paul the chosen one. Paul and his mother were protected by the natives, but House Harkonnen would not give up on hunting them down. They sent people to Arrakis, and the natives set a trap using fake corpses and sand hammers to attract sandworms. House Harkonnen soldiers ran to the cliff edge, jumped lightly, and soared to the highest point. But this was actually the natives' true intention. They used hidden weapons to wipe out the soldiers, then extracted the water from their bodies and gathered the corpses together to summon the sandworms and destroy the evidence. Although Paul had proven his abilities to the natives, many still believed he was a spy. When mother and son were taken back to the underground city, they were met with harsh words from many people. To be accepted, mother and son had to undergo a trial. Coincidentally, the native Holy Mother was about to die, and Paul's mother, a member of the sisterhood, became the heir. However, she had to drink the deadly water of life. Only those who survived the poison could become the Holy Mother. Without hesitation, she drank the poison and collapsed instantly, her body twitching uncontrollably. A few minutes later, she opened her eyes, and her eyes had turned the same blue as the natives. It turned out that her body could naturally break down the poison, and it was nothing to her. She successfully became the new Holy Mother. Meanwhile, the leader took Paul to the desert center. To survive here, he had to adapt to the environment. If Paul could cross the desert and rest for a night in a distant tent, he could return the next day without trouble. Through their daily interactions, the native girl became certain that Paul was not a bad person. She taught Paul how to walk in the desert, showing him how to change his pace and foot pressure to avoid disturbing the sandworms. With Cheney's help, Paul successfully passed the trial. As they spent more time together, they gradually developed feelings for each other. One day, House Harkonnen sent out heavy matches, and the natives ambushed them from below the sand, killing one of them by surprise. This battle was planned and commanded by Paul, and it earned him the respect of the people, allowing him to join the death squad. Finally, Paul passed the last trial of taming a sandworm, earning the complete trust of the natives. They saw him as the chosen one. War was quietly approaching. The Atreides family had been repelling Harkonnen attacks for years, which angered the Baron greatly. After being poisoned earlier, the Baron had to soak in black spice to recover his strength. Meanwhile, an explosion at the planet's spice vault destroyed 80% of the spice, which sent the Baron into a rage. He decided to entrust the task of reclaiming the spice to his nephew, Fade. Fade was bloodthirsty and merciless, while others sought wealth and beauty. He craved pain and killing. His subordinates made a new dagger for him. He extended his tongue to test its sharpness, and with a quick swipe, he killed a mate standing next to him. He was still unsatisfied with the sharpness of the dagger, and killing felt no pleasure to him. His subordinates, sweating in fear, quickly promised to make a dagger that would satisfy him. On this day, it was Fade's birthday. The Baron, eager to please, prepared a beast fight for him. Fade could face a prisoner in a 1v1 duel. Under the watchful eyes of thousands, Fade's eyes seemed like black holes, devoid of any human emotion. As expected, after killing 3 men, he still didn't want to stop, and a huge sense of satisfaction washed over him after stabbing the last one. The Baron was very pleased with him, ordering him to immediately launch an attack on Arrakis. Not only House Harkonnen needed the spice, but another inexperienced squad came, found the spice mine, and immediately started the extraction. They carefully stepped on the sand, knowing that one misstep could attract a sandworm. After walking a few steps, the officer noticed something strange in the desert ahead and signaled his men. Suddenly, several bombs shot up from under the sand, and the extraction machine was immediately disabled. The officer drew his dagger and ran toward the natives, but someone appeared from under his feet and tackled him. Looking into his eyes, the officer felt that he looked familiar. Paul raised his hand to signal a ceasefire. When both the officer and Paul took off their masks, the officer was filled with excitement. It turned out that he was one of Paul's father's men. The officer led Paul to a cave, where the family's atomic bombs were stored, which might help Paul in his mission. That night, Paul woke up from a nightmare. He dreamed that Cheney was in danger, and quickly ran out to check on her. Seeing that Cheney was safe, he sighed in relief. But Cheney was staring intently at something ahead. Paul turned around and saw flames filling the sky. He knew it was House Harkonnen. Fade's method of attack was very simple and brutal. He sent an air force to bomb the northern base of the natives with the largest bombs. The bombing lasted for several hours, and the natives had no means to retaliate against this devastating attack. They knew House Harkonnen would return to reload the bombs, and a new round of attacks would soon follow, so everyone had to move south immediately. However, Paul hesitated. Arriving on Arrakis, his ability to foresee the future had once again been amplified. He saw a massacre of epic proportions, with corpses everywhere and the cries of the people, all because of him. He even saw that the Emperor would die at his hands, and he would become the new ruler. What was even harder for him to accept was that, while bearing all of this, his lover Cheney would be taken from him forever. Cheney reassured him that as long as he remained true to himself, she would always love him. Encouraged by Cheney, Paul decided to head south, knowing that escaping wouldn't solve anything. The future he feared would eventually come. They rode the sandworms, quickly heading south. To solidify Paul's rule, his mother made him drink the water of life. Paul passed out immediately. His mother said only the tears from the desert spring could wake the Messiah. Cheney's name in Fremen language means desert spring. She shed a single tear and mixed it with the water of life, placing it on Paul's lips. When he woke up, Cheney wasn't happy. She knew this was a scheme orchestrated by Paul and his mother, just to make the people of the South believe that Paul was the Messiah. At that moment, all the natives had pledged their loyalty to him. He stood on a cliff, raising his arms and proclaiming that he was the chosen one. He called on all the natives to unite and fight against the invading enemies, including the Emperor. Paul's call was answered by all. He used his family's seal to challenge the Emperor. When the Emperor saw the seal, he realized that the Messiah who had appeared out of nowhere was Paul, and the Holy Mother of the natives was none other than his own mother. Soon, a spaceship approached the desert. The Emperor accepted Paul's challenge, and all his soldiers prepared themselves in the midst of a massive sandstorm. The storm was fiercer than usual. Inside his tent, Paul was making detailed military preparations. The time had come. Paul gave the order, and missiles were launched, hitting a mountain not far away. The sky was filled with fire as a mushroom cloud rose. The explosion sent rocks flying toward the Emperor's army, burying them under sand and debris. It was only with great difficulty that they managed to regroup, but they felt the ground tremble beneath them. A giant abyssal mouth appeared from behind the sandstorm. 3 enormous sandworms charged toward the army. The natives stood on the backs of the sandworms, controlling their movement. Seeing that the ground battle was completely under control, the aerial fleet appeared, but they were also shot down by the natives riding on the sandworms' backs, and the wreckage was consumed by the sandstorm. The Suicide Squad launched the final assault. Paul, leading the natives, had completely secured victory. At House Harkonnen's palace, there was a loud explosion as the gates were blown open. Paul, leading his army, walked in and approached the Baron, sending him straight to hell. The Baron's corpse was thrown into the desert to be devoured by ants, eventually becoming food for the sandworms. At this time, warships from various noble houses hovered in the sky. Paul sent them a warning. If any house dared to attack him, he would launch an atomic bomb to destroy the spice fields. He then turned to the emperor, hoping he would be wise enough to abdicate the throne immediately. Paul promised to spare his life and marry the princess, ruling the universe together. At this moment, Fade stepped forward. He demanded a final duel with Paul. The two fought fiercely, each unable to gain the upper hand. To be honest, Fade had initially underestimated him, but eventually, Fade seized his chance and grabbed Paul by the neck. His dagger pointed at Paul's carotid artery. To his surprise, Paul reversed the situation and killed him. The emperor, witnessing Paul's strength, finally accepted the reality and decided to hand over the throne to him. Everyone knelt to welcome the new emperor, except for Cheney. She couldn't accept Paul taking the role of the Messiah and leading the natives from a position of superiority. She also couldn't understand the fake death act Paul and his mother had staged. Cheney left on her own and ventured into the desert, activating the sandworm traps to summon the great beasts. Meanwhile, Paul, with his followers, began launching attacks on the other noble houses.